All right, welcome back everyone to the latest edition of the online Peace Science Colloquium. If you're tuning in for the first time, either live or on one of our recorded videos, my name is Brad Smith. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and I co-host this online colloquium with my colleague at Vanderbilt, Cassie Dorff. If you've never watched the colloquium before, we are affiliated with the Peace Science Society International. We've been running since 2015. And our goal is to bring the great research that happens at each year's annual meeting of the Peace Science Society to all of you in your offices and homes all year round. So with that said, this week we have a really nice paper and an excellent set of panelists. The paper we're going to be discussing today is called Economic Sanctions and Target Public Opinion, Experimental Evidence from Turkey. The author of the paper is Omer Zarpli. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Pittsburgh, and he's currently on the job market. So be sure to check out his website and the rest of his research. We have two wonderful discussants joining us today. We have Stephen Caudoin, who's an assistant professor at Harvard University, as well as Dursun Peksen, who is a professor at the University of Memphis. So the structure of the colloquium today is going to be, as it usually is, we're going to allow Omer to present his work for about 15 minutes. And then we'll open the floor up for discussion. We'll collect some comments for about 10 minutes or so each from our panelists, and then we'll have a free-ranging discussion with the time we have left. If you're tuning in live, feel free to drop questions, comments in the chat, and we'll try to get to them if we have time. And if we run out of time and aren't able to get to those comments from the live audience, we'll be sure to pass them along to Omer so that he can mull them over as he revises the paper further. So with that, I'll turn it over to Omer. If you could share your screen, and we'll all mute our mics. Looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Omer Zarpli, and today I'm going to present my paper that focuses on the effect of economic sanctions on the public opinion in the sanctioned state or the target state. So the literature on sanction effectiveness highlight that public opinion is crucial to understanding when sanctions succeed and when they do not. One of the reasons why scholars have argued that sanctions do not succeed is that they fail to generate a domestic political cost for the targeted leaders. And one of the reasons this happens is that instead of turning the public opinion against their leaders, sanctions can actually rally the target public around the leaders. So the question of when do sanctions turn the public against the leader, or when does it lead to backlash, is very important to understanding sanction effectiveness. Despite this, until very recently, studies have not directly tested this relationship. So very recently, a few studies on this question aim to address this gap through a series of experimental studies from Israel, Russia, and China. But they produce mixed findings. Some of them find that the sanctions lead to a backlash, others find null effects. So I build on these studies, and I more specifically examine the effect of uncertainty over sender intentions, which I believe remains unexplored. I do this through a survey experiment in Turkey, which has recently become target of US sanctions for its purchase of Russian air defense systems. So briefly, uncertainty is a central concept in the IR literature. It is believed to be a very important obstacle to international cooperation by both realist scholars, but as well as the rationalist scholars. Despite that, the effect of uncertainty during economic sanctions has not been examined to the same extent. Most studies focus on the militarized conflicts when they examine the effect of uncertainty. This is surprising given that uncertainty during economic sanctions is actually very common. Even though states generally declare certain objectives and they make official demands from the target state that need to be met before the sanctions can be lifted, there's still uncertainties about the real or the true preferences or the real objectives of the sanctioning state, in other words, the sender state. Leading the scholars to conclude that actually very few sanctions are crafted with a clear sense of purpose. And there may be several sources for this uncertainty. One is sanctions may be used not necessarily primarily for the purpose of achieving certain foreign policy objective, but they may be more geared towards for the domestic audiences in the sender state. A second possible source of this uncertainty is the sanctions may be used for certain foreign policy objectives, but these objectives may not necessarily be the same as the official objectives. And there might be several reasons why states might want to hide their true preferences or true goals. Those goals, they might believe that those goals would not be perceived as legitimate by the international community, or in some cases, they might even be illegal. Just to give an example, for instance, what is the goal of the US sanctions against Iran, right? Is it to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, which is the official goal, or is it regime change? Again, examples can be multiplied. In the past, a similar situation existed during 1990s during the sanctions against Iraq or against Libya, today perhaps against sanctions against Russia. But again, one thing to note is that this uncertainty do not necessarily have to be about regime change. And actually the case that I have picked to test my theory, the Turkish case, has actually, in that case, uncertainty has nothing to do with the regime change. So my theory, I argue that there are two mechanisms through which this uncertainty over sender intentions can affect public opinion. One is such uncertainty can heighten the fear of getting cheated among the target public. Such uncertainty implies that even if the target complies with the demands of the sender, there's still a risk that the sender will not lift the sanctions, right? So why should I even comply in the first place? And studies mainly in social psychology show that individuals, first, they're averse to getting cheated. And secondly, situations of asymmetrical information, in other words, in a situation where one party has private information, these situations are most conducive to triggering this, the fear of getting cheated. And then again, studies in social psychology, also behavioral economics, show that individuals tend to punish cheaters, even if it comes at a personal cost. And a similar line of argument has been made in the IR literature. It is argued that individuals do not approve of their government leaders when those leaders over-cooperate or cooperate without reciprocation. The second causal mechanism is, I argue that uncertainty could just increase the sheer sense of threat among the target public. The risk that there's something greater going on, there's a greater scheme that the sender is after something greater. So the sanctions, the official goals, the official demands are just the tip of the iceberg. This could, I believe, trigger a sense of threat. And again, which in turn could lead to greater cohesion and also greater resistance to policy change. I also argue that even though uncertainty may have a negative effect, it is likely to be moderated by a number of factors. The first one is partisanship. A host of studies in the IR literature show that external interventions in domestic affairs generally lead to heterogeneous effects. And in some cases, it leads to a polarized effect, where some segments of the public supporting, while the other segments of the public opposing it. So I argue that the government supporters are likely to be particularly, they're likely to show a particularly negative reaction to such to such uncertainty. And the second one is economic cost, and this mainly builds on the conflict literature, which generally shows that, that individuals are conflict averse, they're cost averse, and as the cost of a conflict increases, they are more likely to support capitulation. So just to present my hypotheses very briefly, the first hypothesis is that the public support for policy change in the target declines when there's uncertainty over the intentions of the sender. The negative effect of the uncertain intentions will be more pronounced among the supporters of the target government, and that this negative effect will likely be, the third hypothesis is that the negative effect will likely to be dampened when the individuals are given information about the likely economic cost of the sanctions. So I test these hypotheses using online survey experiment in Turkey. I recruit the respondents using Facebook ads, which is a fairly convenient way, especially in the Turkish case. There are 57 million Facebook users in Turkey, which corresponds to almost 70% of the country's entire population. So today I'm going to present results from a pilot survey, but I am right now collecting responses for the final survey, and I aim to reach about 1,200 respondents. So as I briefly mentioned, the survey exploits recent sanctions against Turkey announced in December 2020, in the last weeks of the Trump administration. The background to this is, this has been a pretty long process. Turkey has been trying to acquire surface-to-air defense, air defense missiles for almost a decade. First, it tried to get them from China, but then the Chinese company that produced those missiles were under U.S. sanctions because of its links with Iran. So Turkey had to give up on that, and then the next seller was Russia. And then 2017, Turkey signed an agreement to purchase these missiles. So the official goal of the US, which can be seen in the press statements by the US State Department, is that to deny Russia, Russian defense sector access to funds and protect US military technology and personnel. Despite this official goal in Turkey over the past several months, there has been speculations that the real goal of the US sanctions is to undermine Turkey's self-reliance in defense industry. And this claim is actually voiced directly by the President Erdogan, but also other pundits have raised similar concerns that the real goal of the sanctions is to actually weaken Turkish military and actually undermine Turkey's military operations, especially in Syria, against the Kurdish armed groups, which the US supports. So I randomly assign respondents to 4 groups. The control group receives neutral information about the imposition of sanctions, and it receives no other information about the intentions of or the goals of the US. And in the treatment, I have 3 treatment groups, and in those groups, I manipulate information about the official goals of the US, and then I introduce uncertainty about these goals. So the control group simply reads, last December, the US has imposed economic sanctions in reaction to purchase of S-400 missiles from Russia. In this respect, a number of restrictions has been placed on the Directorate of Defense Industry, making importation and exportation of military equipment more difficult. So this is just to get a baseline support for policy change. And the first treatment group receives information about the official US goals and information that experts agree that this is actually indeed the real goal. So the US has stated that its goal is to prevent Russia from gaining influence and funds. Some experts agree that the real objective of these sanctions is indeed to weaken Russia. The treatment group two received the same information about the official goal, but then here I introduce some uncertainty, some expert disagreement about the real goals. It says the US stated goal is to prevent Russia. Some experts, however, raised doubts that the real objective of the US is to limit Turkey's autonomy in defense industry and weaken Turkish military capabilities. And the last treatment group is the same as the treatment number 2, but I introduce information about the potential economic cost of sanctions if additional sanctions are imposed. And just to remind you that currently the sanctions are pretty targeted and pretty limited. So far there has not been a major economic fallout from the sanctions. But if this dispute continues and the US imposes additional sanctions, this is a real possibility. So in the last treatment group, they received information that some experts noted that the potential economic damage if the US imposes additional sanctions. So the outcome variable is a single question, which says that Turkey should change its S-400 policy and reach an agreement with the US. It's a categorical variable that ranges from 1 to 5, strongly disagree to strongly agree. So in this pilot, this table presents results from the pilot survey. I had about 173 respondents, so it's a pretty small sample. I have 2 groups. I don't have the control group. I only have the first and the second treatment group. So what I see here is that the support for policy change and the treatment 2 is uncertainty, and the treatment 1 is official goal and expert agreement. That actually the uncertainty indeed does have a negative effect, even though this doesn't reach statistical significance, which is not surprising by itself, given the small sample size. So I also want to just briefly mention a similar, actually almost identical survey experiment I ran in India. I picked India because India has also similar problem with these S-400 missiles. India has reached an agreement with Russia in 2018 to buy these. And US has similarly opposed the purchase of these missiles. And US very recently threatened sanctions. So it's actually very similar situation. So the survey is almost identical. I just changed a wording slightly to match the local context. In the Indian context, the sanctions have not been imposed yet. It's the threat of sanctions. And the outcome variable is very similar. India should change its policy. It should not buy air defense missile systems from Russia. So here I have actually 3 groups. So I have slightly more respondents. So the first table here is actually the same comparison as the previous table. This tests the effect of the uncertainty, and what we see here is that actually it has similar negative effect, and substantively the magnitude of the effect is also very similar. The difference is that the support for policy change in India is slightly higher than Turkey, which is not very surprising because support for the US in India is much higher than in Turkey. So, but the effect of the uncertainty is very similar. Again, it doesn't reach statistical significance. Here I test the effect of economic cost. And again, as I expected, again, the only difference between these 2 groups is that the third treatment group has information about the potential economic cost. So what we see is that this information has a positive effect, and the effect is a little bit larger, but again, it doesn't reach statistical significance. Just to wrap up, so these coefficient plots show the effect of partisanship. So it's the second hypothesis. So if you look at on the left panel, this shows the results from the Turkey sample, and on the right panel, it's the results from the India sample. what we see here is that, and the red dot and the error bars show the effect of these variables in the full sample, and the blue dots and the error bars show the effect of the variables on the just the government supporters. And if you only look at the uncertainty treatment, we see that in the full sample, there is weakly negative effect, but we see that the negative effect strengthens among the supporters of the government. The same here in the India sample, that is the effect of the uncertainty treatment is much stronger. And especially if you look at the Turkey sample, most of the variables are in the expected direction, especially people who have more favorable opinions of the US are more likely to support capitulation. Similarly, people who have more favorable opinion of Russia are more likely to be against policy change. So just to conclude, preliminary findings are generally in line with my expectations, at least in the sense that it's in the right direction. And another striking similarity is that there are strong similarities between the results from Turkey and the India samples, which I think contributes a little bit to the generalizability of the findings. So in general, the findings indicate that the effect of sanctions on target public opinion can vary, even holding a number of factors fixed, such as sender identity, sanction type, and the issue area. So it also implies that the senders can minimize the risk of backlash by avoiding sending mixed signals that increases the uncertainty about their goals. So just to briefly, next steps, collect data on the larger sample, which is currently underway. Depending on the type of data I get, I hope to conduct some sentiment analysis. Right after the asking my outcome question, which is I support policy change, I ask the respondents to explain their answer, their reasoning, why they answered the way they did. This is an open-ended question. So if I get good data on that, so far it seems to be mixed. Sometimes there are good responses, sometimes there's one word response or no response at all. So I'm hoping that I will get enough to do this. And the next step is to replicate this in India. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Omer. So before I turn over to discussion, I think it'd be useful, Omer, if you could just give us a few words about kind of where the project sits in your overall research, what kind of feedback you're looking for. You talked a little bit about next steps for the project, but what kind of feedback would be most useful for you to kind of help us frame the discussion?
Yeah, so I mean, goes without saying, any feedback is a good feedback. I mean, given that, I would especially appreciate feedback on the theoretical aspects, on the framing of the paper. But of course, I mean, research design as well. So this is again part of my dissertation, and I have a couple of other paper ideas, coming off this. So I guess, I don't know, maybe I'm not too helpful, but any feedback is appreciated.
That's great. That's exactly what we're looking for. Okay, so so for the rest of our time, I think let's start off by collecting as many comments as we can. So if Stephen and then Dursun, each of you want to take 10 minutes and just kind of go through the high points of the feedback that you want to offer to Omer, and then once we've gotten all of that, we'll give Omer a moment to respond, and then we'll just kind of have a discussion and see where that takes us. So I'll turn it over to you, Stephen.
Great, thanks, Bradley, and thank you, Omer, for the paper. Thanks both Bradley and Jennifer for organizing and for other folks for being here as well. All right, so when I was reading this, I thought the strength of this paper was how it works towards modeling the effect of sanctions on public opinion in the target, but adding in kind of a broader set of concerns that target citizen might have, rather than just kind of thinking of something as a narrow lane single policy issue. And it does this by adding this kind of interesting and prominent feature of uncertainty over the sanction sender's attributes. So I think this is kind of a well-timed paper. The experimental sanctions public opinion literature is fairly small, but it's growing. And so I think that this paper does a good job adding that new theoretical concept and then looking at it into important and real world contexts. All right, so the biggest comment I had is about the theory. And I think it might be helpful to think about benchmarking the theory in terms of what the underlying model is that you have in mind. And so one way that I would say to think about this would be to say, what is the parameter in the implied model that the person in the target country doesn't know? And there are kind of different strands that pop up in the presentation and in the paper. So I'm going to pluck on a couple of them, suggest a different, but potentially a slightly different one, and then also look at how they map onto your real world examples and then the survey design. All right, so strand number one is you describe things as the target citizen doesn't know the sender's reservation value for the amount of policy change that it would take to get the sanctions removed. So this is like the target sender saying, I don't want to change policy because I just don't actually think this will result in the sanctions getting lifted. And in the presentation, this is how you described the kind of fear of getting cheated mechanism. A slightly different version of this might say, I'm uncertain about the sender's resolve. I'm uncertain about how much they're willing to bear the costs of the sanctions on themselves, because conventional wisdom says sanctions always shoot yourself in the foot to a certain degree. So how much is the sender resolved to incurring those costs before they're willing to remove the sanctions themselves? And the third strand, which is one that I think maybe finds the most support in the results you get, in part because of the survey design, but the third strand is it the sender, am I uncertain about the sender's underlying affinity or disaffinity towards my target government or towards my country writ large? So this is like the target citizen saying, man, I know they didn't like us, but I didn't know they hated us this much. And this is kind of the way you describe the sheer sense of threat mechanism in the presentation. And so the reason why I think this is worth crystallizing is because it helps you hone the real world stories and motivations that you put into the paper. So for example, there's a lot about Iraq, and you use Iraq to say, are sanctions about weapons or are they about regime change? And in my mind as a reader, I'm thinking, well, can't they be about both? And they probably are in many cases. So the sender, all else equal, would probably prefer a regime change, and kind of no one on either side thinks otherwise. So in these Iraq examples, there was no uncertainty about what the United States wanted. And in fact, the Iraqi Liberation Act of 1998 made it US policy to support domestic opponents to the Saddam Hussein regime. So like there was no ambiguity on this one. So then the way the paper describes Iraq is sort of like version one of the model descriptions. The Iraqi citizen is saying to herself, well, even if we give up the weapons, even if we give up our weapons, the US won't lift sanctions, so what's the point? But then in the Turkish case, your description is more like version two of the model, or I guess what I call version three, where there's uncertainty about affinity. So when Erdogan says things like, these sanctions are really about the Kurds, presumably a Turkish person would say, wow, US and Turkish interests are more divergent than I thought. I thought this was a spat over some missiles, but really there's 12 dimensions of policy disagreement rather than one, missiles. So I probably don't want to make the policy change that they're demanding. And this kind of, the closest work I have seen would be that paper that you cited from Steinberg, where people in China updated about kind of the underlying value of an economic policy in the light of US sanctions. Right, so the second related reason why I think it's worth really pinning down what the underlying model looks like is because it informs how you would word the treatments in the survey. So the Indian treatment is very broad. It says US intentions are to limit Indian foreign policy autonomy, which doesn't mention regime change. And this that prompt seems to fit best with that latter version of the model, where I'm updating about preference alignment and the affinity writ large between US and Indian interests. The Turkish treatment is similar, but it's a little bit less broad. So I think one potential consideration would be to like pick one model and run with it and make the treatment look like that really, really closely, or B, potentially cut something else from the arms of the treatment and have one version of uncertainty that looks like the affinity mechanism and one version of uncertainty that looks like the I don't know something about the target's willingness to bear cost mechanism. So the second comment I would make is also theoretical, and it's about whether or not we should expect backlash. So backlash is kind of the finding in a lot of the newer sanctions public opinion experiments. But the way some theoretical mechanisms in the paper are described, they might describe resistance, but not necessarily backlash. So if I'm uncertain over the sender's intentions, and that uncertainty stems from if I remove or change my policy, they won't actually change the sanctions, then that to me would imply the sanctions are less effective, like they're not going to compel the target to comply. But I'm not sure then why I up my anger and the intensity of my dislike of the sender. So why would, if backlash is an increase in underlying support for the policy that the sanctions are targeting, then why would this uncertainty over sender costs mechanism change or amplify that backlash as opposed to just muting the ability, blunting the ability of the sanctions to get me to change? And to be clear though, I think the threat and siege mentality, they just hate us affinity mechanism, I think you're on a stronger footing there to get kind of backlash as opposed to blunted effects. But for the first version of the uncertainty mechanism, I think it was less clear to me. All right, third out of 4, so almost done. So third is, I think it's worth thinking about the types of foreign policies and sanctions that you would think that this applies to. And I say this in part because we're seeing a sort of expansion of what we think sanctions and economic coercion mean. So think like Dov Levain's more recent work on partisan electoral interventions. And it seems like there's a widening of the aperture of what it means to use a foreign policy tool to coerce someone to change their regime or to change their policy. And so I don't want you to be like kind of caught adrift there, too narrowly focused on sanctions, or without a way to say, this is the type of coercive mechanism that my arguments would fit with. And so some sanctions out there are really explicit and they're pretty well laid out. There's kind of not much uncertainty. So think the US and European Union's generalized system of preferences policies. These are sanctions that are also not about defense issues. They say, if you want to get this trade benefit, fix your labor issues, etc. Kind of there's no way for that to expand to regime change or anything like that. Kind of they are statutorily narrowly defined. And then other interventions are directly about regime change. So everything in Dov Levain's data set as well. So I would ask, do you think that your theoretical arguments would work in those other contexts? And there's value in thinking about why or why not. And it's totally okay if the answer is no. Like it's still valuable to say something about this type of economic coercive policy, but it's worth thinking about where you would draw that circle. And the fourth one is the shortest one, which would be, it sounds like you're thinking about possible changes to the survey for the next rounds. So I would throw out my 2 cents, which would be to say, I might cut the economic harm and the economic harm moderation arguments, because it seemed like it was sort of a substitution effect where if you give me 10 reasons to hate a sanction or to hate the sanction sender, then that dampens the individual effect of any one of those reasons, which seems sort of like yeah, I'm with you. But so unless you kind of have a particular reason why that synergy is really worth zooming in on, then I might instead reallocate Facebook eyeballs towards different treatments or back towards the original treatments. But again, good job. And I'm looking forward to hearing what Dursun and the audience have to say too.
Thanks, Stephen. I will we'll keep moving along with collecting comments. Dursun, if you want to take it away.
Sure. Thanks to Jennifer and Bradley for organizing this webinar, this online seminar, I guess, or online panel. And Omer, I think it's a well-written paper. It is obviously a work in progress. I think the final product will look really good, and it's a relatively significant contribution to the existing literature on sanctions and public opinion. So I sort of 6 substantive comments that I would like to just briefly talk about. Some of them may overlap with what Stephen already said, but hopefully they're not very similar to what he already discussed. So my first comment is on the sort of these what sanctions, what a typical sanctions regime looks like, right? Sort of like I will make the argument that most sanctions have sort of multiple goals and tend to send like mixed goals, right? If you just look at a typical sanctions data set, right? The ties or the or the how far it all sanctions database, right? You will see that they actually list multiple sanctions goals or issue types, right? I think in the threat and imposition sanctions data set, there are like 13 or 15 different issue types. And what happens oftentimes that in a given sanction regime, multiple sort of issues or goals are tend to be involved at least as Sanders says, tend to issue multiple goals, or at least that's what they tell us, right? So that's why I would just come up with a case where you think that there's very limited uncertainty, and then that will be your sort of like the baseline case, and then tell that, look, if there's more uncertainty, right, then this is what happens, right? What is a typical case, right? Especially in cases involving like political purposes, right? Maybe in a trade dispute or an environmental dispute, the goal might be very straightforward, but sanctions are imposed, regarding issues like nuclear proliferation, support for terrorism, human rights, democratization, all those things, right? So what is it that a typical case that you think there's no uncertainty, hence things may look different from cases where you are claiming there's a lot of uncertainty, these things will get complicated, right? And it will hurt Sanders' ability to achieve its intended policy objective, right? i.e. sanctions will fail, right? So that's one thing that I would think about it, sort of like, are there really many cases where sanctions are not uncertain in general, right? So my second sort of comment slash question is like, what causes this uncertainty, right? Sort of like, I think Stephen mentioned in terms of like, when we talk about targeted public, right? So like citizens of target states, right? Is it because Sanders are sending mixed signals, or is it because the government manipulates sanctions and shapes the public opinion using the press and other sort of tools, right? So what is it what do you mean by uncertainty, and how certain are you that it is because of the way Sanders acts, or is it because of the goals of the mixed goals or multiple goals that Sanders have, as opposed to the way that the target leadership takes advantage of sanctions and exploits them, right? If it's the latter case, then Sanders can't do much, right? Regardless of how clear-cut their goals are. Even if, say, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, or the Biden administration or Trump administration comes out and says, look, we swear this is the goal of sanctions, right? As long as the target state changes or manipulates or rewards or portrays the goal differently, then it's really not about the standards, but it's more about what targets do with the sanctions and how much they take advantage of it or exploit it, right? So, so I will think about a little bit more about the term uncertainty and what causes it, right? So the third my third main comment is on sort of unpacking public opinion. What you are doing is really important. I totally agree that we know very little about when and under what circumstances like people rally around the leadership as opposed to side with the sanctioning states, right? Although like Galton told us in the 60s, right, that there is this rally around the flag effect, but we still don't know, right? There are a handful of cases that you already cited in the paper. So having said that, right, and you are taking on this very challenging task, but I will sort of like think a little bit more about pro-government people versus opposition groups, right? Sort of like, I think that dichotomy might be somewhat problematic, right? Because even within the opposition, that there could be some who will be supporting the existing sanction regimes or who will be siding with the government, right? So the Turkey case is a great one, right? If it is the issue, if the one of the reasons why Turkish public is skeptical of sanctions due to the Kurdish issue, right? One of the main political parties in Turkey is Kurdish-dominated HTB, right? Why will they be skeptical, right? Why will they not side with the sender as opposed to the party, right? And in the case of Turkey also, a lot of sort of left-leaning parties could be as hawkish as right-leaning parties, right? Think about CHP, one of the sort of the major left-leaning or mainstream parties, right? Or centrist parties. But if you look at their foreign policies, tend to be as hawkish as, it's surprising to say, about the far-right party of MHP, right? Sort of like in the context of even Turkey, I don't think that the so-called opposition is very, very sort of unified. There's so much variance within the opposition. So when you think about partisanship, you should probably go beyond that and see what kind of policy issues sort of what are their sort of stance on certain foreign policy issues, right? Which might affect. So that's why I think unpacking public opinion farther than the way you do might be crucial. So that's my my third comment. The fourth comment is related to this unpacking a public opinion, right? Sort of think about the existing public public policy approach to sanctions, right? Late 80s, right? Kemper and Lowenberg's piece on how sort of there are winners and losers of sanctions, right? Sort of like when you think about the cost of sanctions, if your argument holds, it depends, right? If you think that the target public might be more favorable towards their governments changing their policies due to this cost, right? But it depends on who incurs the suggested cost, right? There will be some, economic groups who will benefit from trade restrictions, right? It could sort of, or some of them will win, some of them will lose. A typical sort of like an environment where there will be some winners and losers of sanctions. I will think about it by referring to especially the public public policy approach in the public choice approach in the sanctions literature. I don't think that everyone will have, not only will have the same amount of will incur same amount of cost from sanctions, but also some will favor sanctions because they will economically benefit from those sanctions, right? My fifth comment is on the sort of think about sort of like these cases, right? One interesting thing is that like there is some countries face sanctions for a long time, right? You know, sort of like North Korea since 50s, right? Cuba since 60s, right? You're referring to Iraq since 1990s, right? Or even prior to that, sort of like in the case of Iran since 1979, early 80s, right? Even in the case of Turkey, right? Right before Turkey faced multiple sanctions in the 1980s, right? Due to the military coup, and prior to that in 1970s due to the Cyprus dispute, and during the Trump administration due to the political imprisonment of Pastor Brunson, right? So there's a long history of sanctions that target public gets exposed to, right? Like all these different sanctions occur. So do they react very differently if there are multiple ongoing sanction cases, right? What is that Iranian public should do now that Biden may either lift or add additional sanctions to what Trump did, right? Or compared to during the Obama administration. So that is there any sort of lingering effect of past sanctions, former sanctions, or ongoing sanctions on what people think today? I would just think about that a little bit more. And my final comment is sort of like this is a promising paper, right? One thing that a lot of your readers will sort of ask you, so what, right? So what are some of the sort of real world implications of what you are suggesting? What are some of the key policy implications, right? So of course, the question is that given that a sizable, a large number of sanctions target sort of non-democratic regimes, right? Even if sort of some of your arguments hold, right, in the broader cases, right? Sort of like, does it really matter in terms of the success of sanctions, right? Those policymakers in the United States, right? Even if they send all this clear-cut sort of signals to the target, and if the opposition sides with the sender and pressurize try to pressurize the target states, how often does it actually work, right? I know you briefly said that public opinion matters in non-democracies, but what are those cases, right, where the significant change in public opinion, especially among a sort of anti-government groups or pro-government groups, really had a sort of a discernible, significant impact on the overall outcome of sanctions, right? So what is that, this signaling effect, this clear-cut sending better signals will have in terms of the overall success rate of sanctions? That's about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Dursun. So I'll add two very quick comments before we have discussion with the remainder of our time. So one of the comments is going to connect to something that Stephen brought up, and one of them is going to connect to something that Dursun brought up. So my first thought kind of builds on Stephen's comment about what is the underlying model here and what are we uncertain about. And I think that one thing that you can exploit that the previous literature has considered is that depending on what that underlying parameter is, I think we have different theoretical expectations based on the previous literature about the baseline level of uncertainty that you're going to come in with, right? So if what is uncertain is the level of resolve of the sending state, right, then by the sort of discussion that you have in the paper, I think, the Fironian framework is going to tell us that, states are going to have, they're not going to be able to communicate that effectively, right? And so we should expect that to be unable to be resolved. But then there's some more recent theoretical work that I think speaks to this there's a nice paper by Peter Bills and Will Spanier, right? And I think this would look a little bit more like what I think you have in mind, which is this affinity parameter that Stephen was talking about, right? And so if our policy, we can interpret that as sort of a policy position. And what their work suggests theoretically is that you should be able to resolve that uncertainty by just, simple communication. So we might expect that the baseline level of uncertainty would be lower coming in there. So that may be something to sort of allow you to connect to an additional strand of theoretical work. That's, that work is sort of more about conflict bargaining and not sanctions per se. But I think building further on something Stephen said, I think, you might be able to push out further and sort of connect to that stuff in your theoretical frame. And then the second point, second point I had as I read through is that just to sort of echo something that Dursun brought up, but maybe suggest a paper that might be useful, is that I think it's really important when we're kind of thinking about what the model of learning here is how do the receivers of information that would change their level of uncertainty about the purpose of the sanctions, where is that coming from, right? And so the paper leads off with this quote from Ayatollah Khomeini, right? And so when I think about a member of the public getting that kind of information from a leader, I think that they should, we should expect that they would process that information very differently than if it came from sort of, another source that was perhaps perceived as less biased, right? So if, a leader is going to have obvious incentives to manipulate this information, and theoretically, I would think that we should expect, if the public is sort of behaving in this Bayesian way, which they may or may not be, but that model would suggest that they should discount those kinds of statements, right? And so you may be able to connect to, this literature on theoretical literature on biased political advice. So I have in mind this classic paper by Randy Calvert on value of biased information. That might be something to think about, and it would be interesting in a follow-on study to see if you manipulated that, if that led to differences, right? So in the treatment that you have now, I would think that is sort of the maximum amount of affecting beliefs, right? You frame it as like experts say, right? This neutral source of information. But I wonder if the treatment said, included a hypothetical statement from a Turkish official, if that would move. And I think the theoretical expectation would be that would have a lesser effect because of this discounting. So those are just my two quick points. So Omer, I'll turn it over to you to respond, and then we'll have a discussion with our remaining time.
Thank you so much. This is just amazing. There's so much, and I'm like, I have to think through all of these comments. But just briefly, let me touch upon some of them. Perhaps I won't have time to go all of them, and but so I have thought a lot about just to. Bradley, the last thing that you left the source of the information. I have thought a lot about this, how I should introduce this uncertainty, whether I should give them information about certain action that the US has taken that would signal them that there's uncertainty, right? The US has done this, US has said this, but has done that. So that would introduce some, disconnect between what the US is saying and what the US is doing. In the end, I settled with the most more simple and then more neutral source of information. So about the other couple of other points. What causes uncertainty? that question, I think, again, I talked a little bit about it in the paper. The way I'm dealing with it is there are multiple sources. These could be the potential sources, but in the end, I feel like despite the potentially different sources, those sources does not, the way I see it, does not necessarily affect how that uncertainty affects public opinion, right? Regardless of the source, if there's this uncertainty that the official goals, the real goals do not match the official goals, I would expect a similar effect. And I think that ties, there might be multiple, you're absolutely right. I mean, there might be multiple goals. There's never a single goal, but I think that is also part of the story, that I'm trying to tell. I think there are multiple goals. It might be both regime change and denuclearization. Though I think in that case, I feel like they're kind of mutually exclusive, in the sense that in affecting the behavior of the target, right? I mean, if it's about nuclearization, and then if I get rid of my nuclear weapons and I believe that you will stop, then okay, that's a different story. But if I believe that even if I get rid of my nuclear weapons, you will still keep pressuring me, then I think that's a different that would, I think, affect my calculations. But I think, yes, you're also absolutely right about, the way it does have an effect about the source of the uncertainty does have an effect about the policy implications, I think. Like if it's caused by mixed signals versus the framing by the targeted leader, then yes. Then if it's caused by the framing by the targeted leaders, then there's nothing much that senders can do. But what I don't really get into that too much. But what I think is that yes, absolutely. I mean, the target government, of course, has much more influence over how the public thinks than the other states. But still, I think outsiders can still have some influence by doing their best. I mean, by trying to assure the target public. I mean, and policymakers generally do that. Obama did that in 2009. He essentially recognized Islamic Republic of Iran. And there's so many. I mean, I think I'll leave it at that right now. I have to think through the rest of the comments, especially Stephen. I really appreciate all your comments, all the feedback.
Fantastic, thanks, Omer. So we've got about 6 minutes left. Let's take a moment and just if there's any other last feedback that we want to collect with our last 5 minutes or so, and if not, we can start to wrap it. Looks like we got Stephen back. Awesome. So with our last 5 minutes, just I'll ask our panelists if there's any last follow-up thoughts in light of the responses before we wrap it up.
Maybe one quick comment, Bradley. I I think what you suggest might be fine in terms of I think there are two challenges here to me in terms of this whole concept of the uncertainty, right? What constitutes uncertainty and what causes it? I think those are the two things that I was a little bit struggling when I was reading it. So, and also I will just check out this recent piece it just came out in EJIR, International Journal of International Relations. They show that we always make this assumption that when sanctions hit the target, always the people will it's always the anti-government groups that tend to protest, right? this study shows that, wait a minute, there are also pro-government groups. They may protest around the same time that anti-groups are protesting, right? During the sanctions, right? Sort of like, and they find, this study finds that, right? It's usually how much sort of press freedom exists in the country. If the government controls the media, it's a lot easier to manipulate these sanctions, and it will be easier to mobilize, especially their own supporters, right? Their own coalition groups, and then make them go to streets and protest, right? So I would think about how those manipulation process works, I think, sort of like, and that could be both. I think the way that pro-government and anti-government groups react to sanctions may be quite different.
All right, thanks, Dursun. If there are no other comments, I want to take a moment to thank Omer. I really appreciate you sharing our work, sharing your work with us. Really interesting paper. I'm really excited to see the full survey results, and eventually, excited to see it out in print. Also want to thank Stephen and Dursun. Thank you for the careful read of the paper and feedback. I'm sure it's going to be really useful.
Thank you so much, really, Bradley, and the discussants. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
No worries, our pleasure. I typed up stuff, so I'll send it over your way too.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Excellent. So with that, we will conclude this week's meeting of the Online Peace Science Colloquium. We will be back on March 26th, same time. The place is up to you, as this is virtual, so I would say same place, but that may not be the case. We're going to have a really cool paper I'm excited for us to share with you all, called Remittances, Terrorism, and Democracy by Casey Crispin Cox and Johan Park, both at Texas A&M. So make sure you look out for that announcement and the Zoom link on the Peace Science. It'll be distributed out to the Peace Science listserv. So until then, stay healthy, everyone.